The sound of her heels against the marble floor echoed louder than her heartbeat, but not by much. Emily Hart was late, again. The subway had stalled, and she had sprinted through the crowded Manhattan streets only to find herself gasping for breath as she reached the polished glass doors of Carter and Associates. Inside, the air was cool and still, filled with quiet power that made her nerves buzz even more. She smoothed her blazer with trembling fingers before stepping into the meeting room. Every pair of eyes turned toward her. William Carter, senior partner and her boss, gave her the sort of smile that felt more like a reprimand than a welcome. "Miss Hart," he said, his tone laced with disapproval, "how nice of you to join us." Emily murmured an apology and slid into the empty seat, trying to steady her hands beneath the heavy mahogany table. It was only then she noticed the man seated beside Carter, tall, imposing, dark hair cut with ruthless precision. His suit was worth more than 6 months of her rent, and his eyes, icy, piercing, watching her like a predator who had just spotted weakness. "This is Mr. Alexander Reed," Carter announced smoothly, "CEO of Reed Enterprises, one of our most valuable clients." Alexander inclined his head slightly, his gaze never wavering from her face. Emily felt as though she had been placed on an auction block, her worth silently assessed and measured. "Mr. Reed has a peculiar problem," Carter continued, "one that requires an unusual solution. And you, Emily, are the solution." Emily blinked, startled. As a junior lawyer, she handled research, paperwork, the occasional deposition prep, not clients like this. "Me?" she asked, the word tumbling out before she could stop it. "Yes, you." Carter leaned back, his fingers steepled. "Mr. Reed's visa renewal has been denied, bureaucracy at its worst. Unless he resolves this quickly, Reed Enterprises will be forced to move its headquarters back to Toronto. That would be disastrous for New York, and for this firm." Alexander finally spoke, his voice deep and smooth, the kind of voice that left no room for argument. "I need a permanent solution. Marriage provides that. As an American citizen, you would be ideal." The words hung in the air like smoke. Emily's stomach dropped. "You want me to marry you?" she whispered. "For 1 year," Alexander said, his tone as casual as if he were asking her to pass the salt. "A contract. Nothing more. At the end, a discreet divorce. In return, you'll receive compensation. $7 million. Tax-free, plus an apartment in your name on the Upper East Side." Emily's breath caught. $7 million. With that, she could wipe out her parents' debts from her father's heart attack, clear her brother's student loans, and finally, open the community law practice she had always dreamed of. The temptation was overwhelming, but the pit in her stomach grew deeper. "This is fraud," she said, her voice barely steady. "Not if you treat it as real," Carter cut in smoothly. "You'll live together. Attend social functions, convince everyone, including immigration, that this is genuine." Emily shook her head. "I don't even know him." Alexander leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Miss Hart, I'm not asking for love. I'm offering a business arrangement. You gain financial security. I keep my company here. Simple." Her throat tightened. "And if I refuse?" Carter's smile chilled the air. "Then we'll have to reconsider your future at this firm. We reward loyalty here. You understand?" Emily's palms grew damp against the table. She felt trapped, like the walls were closing in. Her parents' worried faces flashed through her mind. Her brother's sleepless nights, buried in debt. Her own exhaustion, working late into the night, but for a salary that barely covered rent. The choice wasn't fair, but it was a choice. "I need time," she whispered. 24 hours, Alexander replied, already rising to leave. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and inevitability. "My driver will take you home. I'll expect your answer tomorrow." When the door shut behind him, Emily sat frozen, staring at the empty chair he had occupied. $7 million, 1 year, a stranger for a husband, her career, or her soul. The next morning, the leather folder waited for her on her desk, embossed with Reed Enterprises' logo. Her hands trembled as she opened it, scanning the clauses. duration, cohabitation, confidentiality, compensation. All neat, all binding, all terrifying. Her pen hovered above the signature line, the weight of her family's future pressed down on her shoulders. She thought of her father's worn hands, her mother's quiet prayers, her brother's tired eyes. Emily signed. The ink bled into the paper, sealing her fate. The contract was alive, and with it the clock had started. 1 year, $7 million, a marriage built on lies. And as she set the pen down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made the most dangerous decision of her life. The day of the wedding arrived faster than Emily could comprehend, and the city seemed to hum with an energy that made her nerves prickle beneath her skin. Spring sunlight glared off the glass towers of Manhattan as the sleek white car carried her toward the rooftop where she would speak vows she did not believe in, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against the silk of the gown Alexander had ordered for her. A gown she had not chosen, but one that hugged her figure with such precision she could not deny it made her look like a bride from a magazine cover, not a woman about to enter a contract that felt like a trap. When the elevator doors slid open at the top of the Reed building, Emily's breath caught. The rooftop garden had been transformed into a stage. White roses lined a narrow aisle, and lights twinkled against the backdrop of the Manhattan skyline, and waiting at the arch stood Alexander Reed. Tall and perfect in his black tuxedo, his posture as controlled as ever, but his eyes fixed only on her as if daring her to falter. Her legs shook as she stepped forward, clutching her bouquet so tightly she thought the stems might snap. She had imagined this moment as a little girl, but never like this, never with a stranger whose name she had only learned days before. The officiant began to speak, but Emily heard little. Her ears were filled with the rush of blood. Each word of the vows felt like a thread binding her tighter to this man. Alexander's voice was deep, steady, almost tender, and for one dangerous instant she wondered if he meant the promises he spoke. When it was her turn, she forced her voice to remain clear, repeating words of loyalty and love that were nothing but a performance, yet sounded almost convincing even to her own ears. The ring slid onto her finger, heavier than she expected, cold metal warming quickly against her skin. Alexander held her gaze the entire time, and something unreadable flickered in his expression, as if he too was struggling to remember. This was nothing more than a business transaction. Then came the words she had dreaded. "You may kiss the bride." Emily's stomach flipped. They had not discussed this moment. She expected a brush of lips, a staged display. But when Alexander's hand lifted to her cheek and his mouth touched hers, everything inside her shifted. The kiss was not practiced, not cold. It was slow and deliberate and carried a spark that shocked through her veins. The applause of the few witnesses blurred around her. For a heartbeat, she forgot about the contract, forgot about the $7 million, forgot about the lie. When he pulled back, his face was calm again, the mask firmly in place, but Emily had felt it. The quickened breath, the faint tremor in his touch, and she knew he had felt it too. The officiant declared them husband and wife, and the name Mrs. Reed wrapped around her like a chain she had willingly clasped. The lunch that followed was brief and suffocating. Alexander's hand at the small of her back, his fingers laced with hers, every gesture for show, yet every touch sending shivers of confusion through her. When it ended, when the witnesses had gone and the applause had faded, Emily found herself stepping into the private elevator beside Alexander, silence heavy between them. She glanced at him, wanting to speak, wanting to ask what that kiss had been, but his face was unreadable as the city lights slid past the glass walls of the elevator. Only when they reached the penthouse and he pressed a key card into her hand did he speak. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," his voice low, and Emily felt the walls close in. The cage was golden, the doors locked, and the game had only just begun. Emily stepped into the penthouse, and the first thing that struck her was the silence. Not the comforting quiet of a home, but the heavy echo of a space too large, too polished, too empty of life. The floor-to-ceiling windows spilled moonlight over sleek marble and glass. The furniture looked untouched, arranged by a decorator rather than chosen by a hand that lived here. It felt like walking into a museum, not a marriage. Alexander moved across the room with the ease of someone who owned every inch of it. He removed his jacket, loosened his tie, and glanced back at her as if gauging whether she would break under the weight of this new reality. He showed her to a suite that was larger than her old apartment, closets already filled with her clothes, toiletries placed neatly in the marble bathroom. It was unsettling to see pieces of her life transplanted so perfectly into this alien palace. She asked him why he had gone to such trouble, and he answered with the same calm tone he used in meetings. It was necessary for appearances. They must live as husband and wife in every visible way. Emily nodded, but inside her chest tightened with unease. The contract had become flesh and walls and keys, and there was no turning back. That night she lay awake staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, still wearing the weight of his kiss on her lips. She told herself it was all for show yet. When she closed her eyes, she saw his face far too close, felt the steady press of his hand against her back. She hated that her body remembered it as real. Morning came with sunlight flooding the room, and she stumbled to the kitchen, drawn by the smell of coffee. Alexander was there, already dressed for a run, his expression unreadable as he poured her a cup. The small domestic gesture unsettled her more than the grand wedding vows had, because it felt almost normal. He reminded her that immigration officials could question staff or neighbors. Patterns must look authentic. They would eat breakfast together. They would arrive at events together. Every detail mattered. Emily bristled at the control, but Alexander's voice held no arrogance, only precision, as though the marriage was another empire to manage. Still she pushed back, insisting she was not his property, and to her shock he laughed, the sound low, unguarded, almost human. It left her more shaken than if he had shouted. Days blurred into weeks as Emily adjusted to her new cage. She went to work at the firm, and returned each night to the penthouse where Alexander existed like a shadow, sometimes distant, sometimes unexpectedly considerate. One evening she found him in the kitchen preparing pasta with quiet skill. He claimed he disliked relying on others. She helped chop tomatoes, and for the first time they moved around each other like people, instead of strangers, bound by contract. The silence between them softened. Her laughter slipped out before she could stop it, and for a moment the penthouse felt less like a prison and more like the beginning of something she did not dare name. But shadows crept in quickly, whispers at the firm about her whirlwind romance, Carter's smug glances reminding her of the deal, the constant fear of being exposed, and, beneath it all, the growing pull toward the man she was supposed to only pretend to love. Each night when she closed her bedroom door, she swore she would keep her distance. Yet every morning she woke with the sound of his laugh lingering like a dangerous echo. Suspense hung in the air like a storm not yet broken, and Emily knew it was only a matter of time before the rules they had written on paper would shatter in the fire of reality. The night of the gala arrived like a storm she could not outrun. Emily stood before the mirror in a gown that shimmered midnight blue under the soft light. Her pulse drummed so loudly she wondered if the walls of the penthouse could hear it. She told herself this was only another performance, a stage where she must play the perfect wife. Yet deep down she knew this night would decide if their arrangement held firm or cracked under the weight of truth. Alexander appeared in the doorway, dressed in a black tuxedo that made him look untouchable. His eyes swept over her with an intensity that sent heat rising to her cheeks. He offered no compliment, only a simple nod, and somehow that struck harder than words. The car carried them through Manhattan streets, lined with flashing lights. Photographers swarmed as soon as they stepped onto the red carpet outside the Grand Hotel. Alexander's hand settled at the small of her back, firm and steady, guiding her as voices shouted questions. "When did you marry? Who is she?" Emily forced a smile, her heart thundering as Alexander leaned close to whisper, "Keep smiling. They cannot see the cracks." Inside the ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished faces, senators and magnates and rivals all eager to see the man who had always stood alone arrive with a wife on his arm. Emily tried to steady herself with champagne, but her nerves sharpened when a woman in crimson silk approached, tall, flawless, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Claudia," Alexander said with a tone too controlled to be warm. "An old acquaintance." Claudia's gaze swept over Emily like a blade. "So you are the whirlwind bride. How sudden, how curious." Her words dripped with poison, and Emily felt her chest tighten. She wanted to retreat, but Alexander's fingers brushed hers, grounding her. Emily forced a polite smile and replied, "When it feels right. Why wait?" Claudia's expression faltered just slightly, and Alexander's faint nod told Emily she had struck the right chord. The evening unfolded in a blur of introductions. Emily smiled and spoke when required, but she could feel eyes watching, whispers weaving through the crowd, every gesture between her and Alexander dissected. Was it real? Was it a ruse? She could not tell if her trembling hand against his arm was convincing to them or to herself. Then came the moment that stole her breath. The senator's wife leaned close and asked how they had met. Emily repeated the story they had rehearsed, but when Alexander laughed softly at her invented detail about their first dinner, the sound was unplanned, genuine. For a moment even she believed the tale. Music swelled and couples drifted to the dance floor. Alexander extended his hand and murmured, "Everyone is watching." She followed, clumsy at first, until he guided her with a surprising grace. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. He counted under his breath. She met his gaze, and for a heartbeat the world blurred into silence, his hand at her waist, his eyes burning into hers. It felt dangerously real, dangerously, live. Emily knew then that the mask of their contract was slipping, not in front of the guests, but within her own heart, and that terrified her more than the sharpest gossip in the room. When the dance ended, applause filled the air. Claudia watched from the edge, her expression taut with suspicion. Carter lingered near the bar, his smirk telling Emily he still held the strings. Yet none of them unnerved her as much as the warmth in Alexander's touch, the way his breath brushed her ear when he whispered convincing performance. "Well done." She smiled back, but inside she trembled, because she was no longer certain what was performance and what was becoming truth. The weeks after the gala unfolded like a tightrope walk, each day balanced between duty and something far more dangerous. Emily found herself slipping into a rhythm that frightened her. Mornings with coffee shared across the kitchen island, evenings filled with small conversations that felt less like rehearsed lines and more like fragments of a life she should not want. The penthouse no longer echoed like a cage. It began to feel lived in, and that realization pressed against her ribs like a secret she could not confess. One night she returned from the office exhausted, rain clinging to her coat, only to find Alexander waiting by the door. He held out an umbrella she had forgotten and said simply, "You should not walk home drenched." The softness in his tone unsettled her more than any of his commands. She muttered a thank you, but her heart betrayed her with a quick stutter. It was in these small gestures that the lines blurred most. Not the grand events, but the quiet moments no one else could see. The pressure of their lie grew heavier as whispers in the firm sharpened. Carter's smug glances reminded her that he knew too much, and when she walked into meetings, colleagues stared at her ring more than her legal briefs. She fought to hold her ground as a lawyer, to remind herself she was not just a billionaire's wife. But late at night, when Alexander sat across the table reading reports, glasses low in his nose, she caught herself watching him with an ache that had nothing to do with contracts. Suspense wrapped tighter when a letter arrived from immigration officials. An interview was scheduled to verify the authenticity of their marriage. Alexander placed the letter on the table, his expression unreadable. "We will have to be perfect," he said. "Every detail, every memory, our stories must align." Emily nodded, but fear coiled in her chest. This was no longer a simple charade of rings and parties. This was scrutiny that could strip her of everything: the money, her career, her fragile dignity. And yet the part that frightened her most was the thought of being forced away from him. That evening, tension hung heavy in the penthouse. Thunder rolled over Manhattan, and when the storm knocked out power for a moment, the entire space plunged into darkness. Emily startled, clutching the edge of the counter. Alexander's hand found hers in the dark, warm, steady, lingering longer than necessary. When the lights returned, he did not move immediately. Their eyes locked, the storm outside pounding in rhythm with the storm inside her chest. She whispered, "We cannot make mistakes," he answered quietly. "No, we cannot." But neither of them was talking only about immigration anymore. The night ended with silence, both retreating to their separate rooms, yet Emily lay awake listening to the storm and the echo of his voice. She realized the contract clock was ticking not toward an ending she could endure, but toward something more perilous. She was falling for a man who had bought her name and stolen her heart without permission, and the suspense of when and how that truth would break them left her trembling under the dark ceiling, waiting for the next strike of lightning. The day of the immigration interview arrived like a blade pressed against Emily's throat. She woke before dawn with her stomach in knots. The penthouse felt too still, every tick of the clock reminding her that one slip, one misaligned detail could unravel everything. She dressed carefully in a navy dress that spoke of respectability, not extravagance. Her hands trembled as she clasped the necklace Alexander had given her. When she walked into the living room, he was already waiting in a charcoal suit, calm as stone, but his eyes betrayed the tension. He never spoke aloud. In the sleek, black car ride to the federal building, silence pressed between them. Alexander finally broke it with a single sentence. "We must remember every detail. How we met, what side of the bed you sleep on, your favorite color." His voice was low, steady, but Emily heard the faint edge of strain beneath it. She recited the script they had rehearsed, yet her mind kept wandering back to his hand, brushing hers during the storm, the softness of moments that no script had ever accounted for. The interview room was sterile, a windowless box with humming lights and a table too small for comfort. Two officers sat across from them, their questions sharp, invasive. "How did you meet? What did you eat on your first dinner? When did you first say I love you?" Emily felt sweat gather at the back of her neck, but Alexander never faltered. His answers were smooth, precise, delivered with the kind of control that made boardrooms bow. And when they asked Emily for her version, he looked at her with a steady gaze that anchored her trembling heart. She spoke the lines they had prepared, but when asked what she admired about her husband, the truth slipped out before she could stop it. "He notices things. He remembers details no one else cares to." She saw the faintest flicker of surprise in Alexander's eyes, because that was as not in the script. The officers exchanged glances, scribbled notes, and after an agonizing pause, ended the session with clipped professionalism. Emily and Alexander left hand in hand, the performance required until the elevator doors closed. Then Emily exhaled in a shaky rush. Alexander's grip lingered on her fingers, longer than it should have. He studied her face with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "You improvised," he said quietly. She braced for anger, but instead his voice softened. It was convincing, maybe too convincing. That night, back at the penthouse, the tension between them reached a breaking point. The storm of emotions she had bottled up for weeks crashed down. She confronted him in the kitchen, demanding to know what was real and what was still part of the contract. Alexander stood silent for a moment, his jaw tight, then stepped closer until she felt the heat of him surround her. "For appearances," he began, then shook his head as if rejecting his own defense. "No, not for appearances." And before she could speak, his mouth was on hers, fierce and hungry, nothing rehearsed, nothing controlled. The kiss unraveled every boundary they had sworn to keep. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Alexander whispered against her skin, "This was never supposed to happen." Emily trembled in his arms, knowing her world had just shifted again. The contract still bound them, but their hearts had stepped beyond it, and the suspense of what came next loomed like a cliff edge waiting in the dark. Emily woke the next morning with the taste of his kiss still lingering, and the weight of it pressed heavy on her chest. She had not meant to fall asleep in Alexander's arms, but the storm outside and the storm inside had left her drained. When she stirred, she found the space beside her empty, the sheets cool, and for a wild second she wondered if it had all been a dream. But then she saw the faint outline of his jacket draped over a chair, and knew it had been real. Terrifyingly real. The day unfolded with an unease she could not shake. At the firm whispers grew sharper, Carter's smirk more poisonous. He dropped hints about her husband's sudden generosity in funding her brother's research project, as if daring her to admit the marriage was more arrangement than love. Emily forced herself to smile and push back, but inside she was unraveling. Each kindness from Alexander, each careful gesture, pulled her deeper into waters she could not control. That evening, the penthouse lights glowed soft and warm. Alexander was at the dining table, papers spread before him, his tie loosened, a glass of scotch at his side. When Emily entered, he looked up, his eyes searching her face, as if waiting for her to speak first. She sat across from him, silence stretching until she could no longer bear it. "What are we doing, Alexander?" she whispered. His jaw tightened. He pushed his papers aside and leaned forward. "We are surviving, keeping the story alive. but his voice lacked conviction. His hand brushed hers across the table, and the air thickened with everything unsaid. Before either could confess what was clawing at their throats, the phone rang. Alexander answered, his expression hardening with every word. When he hung up, his voice was cold, but his eyes betrayed tension. An audit is being launched. The officials are suspicious. They will dig deeper into us, our families, our history. Emily's blood ran cold. Carter's smug face flashed in her mind. Had he tipped them off? Was someone trying to destroy Alexander by exposing their secret? The suspense wrapped tighter around her ribs until breathing felt like drowning. In the days that followed, they lived under a new kind of siege. Investigators lingered in the lobby. Questions were sent to her parents, to his staff, every detail of their lives dissected. Emily watched Alexander retreat into his fortress of silence, pacing the penthouse at night like a caged lion. Yet when he thought she was asleep, he would pause at her door, as if guarding her, as if protecting what they had built. One night she opened the door and found him there, shoulders tense, eyes tired. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Because you matter more than any of this," he admitted, the words raw, unpolished, dangerous. She should have been afraid. She should have walked away, but instead she stepped into his arms, letting the silence speak for them. Outside forces were closing in. Their fragile arrangement threatened to collapse under scrutiny, yet the bond between them tightened, born not of contracts but of choices. Dangerous choices. The suspense hung heavier than ever, because Emily knew now she was not just fighting for money or appearances. She was fighting for a man she could no longer imagine leaving. The Reed Foundation Gala was supposed to be their grand display of unity, a chance to silence whispers and prove to every watching eye that their marriage was solid. But beneath the glittering chandeliers and the swell of the orchestra, Emily's heart raced with dread. The investigation had already cast shadows. One wrong move tonight could expose them completely. Alexander's hand was firm at the small of her back as they entered, his voice low in her ear. "Smile. Everyone is waiting." His presence steadied her even as the weight of expectation pressed like chains. The ballroom shimmered with senators, tycoons, and reporters hungry for scandal. Carter was there too, circling like a vulture, his smug grin cutting through the crowd. Emily felt her stomach twist, but Alexander's grip tightened, as if to remind her that she was not alone. He introduced her with a pride that startled her, his words soft yet deliberate. "My wife, Emily Reed." Every time he said it, her pulse jumped. Part of her wanted to believe it was more than performance. Halfway through the evening, a woman appeared in a crimson gown that burned against the sea of black and gold. Claudia, her smile sharp as broken glass. She kissed Alexander's cheek as if she owned the right, then turned her gaze on Emily. "So you are the bride. How very sudden." Her voice dripped with mock sweetness. Emily forced a smile, but Claudia pressed on. "I always thought Alexander had no time for romance, no patience for ordinary women." Emily's chest tightened, but she met Claudia's stare without flinching. Sometimes the unexpected lasts the longest. Claudia's eyes flickered, and for a fleeting moment Emily saw Alexander's lips curve in approval. Yet the evening's greatest trial came when Alexander was called to the stage for his speech, leaving Emily alone at the edge of the crowd. Carter swooped in like a hawk, his words low enough to pierce. But not to be overheard. "You're good at this role, Emily. Better than I imagined. But you and I both know this marriage is a ticking clock. When it ends, so does your protection." Emily forced her expression neutral, though his words cut deep, before she could respond. Alexander's voice filled the room, his speech not just about philanthropy, but about the power of second chances, about finding unexpected strength in partnership. Every line felt weighted with double meaning, and when his gaze found hers across the glittering crowd, her breath caught. The evening closed with a dance, Alexander guiding her onto the floor, the music slow, the crowd watching, his hand warm against her back, his voice barely a whisper. "Carter is trying to rattle you. Don't let him." She looked up, and for a moment the world shrank to only his eyes, steady and burning. The pretense fell away, and what lingered between them was something raw and undeniable. As the music swelled, Emily realized the performance had become dangerously real, and the suspense gnawed at her because she no longer feared discovery by officials. She feared what would happen when the contract itself came to its end. 6 months passed in a blur that felt less like pretense and more like life. Mornings with shared coffee, nights with quiet dinners, laughter that came too easily. Emily kept telling herself it was temporary. Yet her heart betrayed her with every glance, every touch. Alexander had stopped being the cold CEO who purchased a wife and had become the man who waited for her after late trials, who listened when she ranted about unfair cases, who remembered the smallest details of her family. Still, the clock on their contract ticked louder with each passing day. The suspense sharpened when a letter arrived scheduling a second immigration review, harsher and more invasive than the first. They were summoned for separate questioning, designed to catch couples who lied. Alexander read the notice in silence, his jaw tight, then said, "We will prepare." But Emily saw the shadow in his eyes. He was not only worried about officials, he was worried about her. What if they asked her a question too personal, something unrehearsed, something that revealed the truth? They both avoided speaking. Days before the review, Alexander surprised her with something that shattered the careful wall between them. He took her to Brooklyn, to a small Italian bistro where her parents had their first date. The owner greeted them as if Alexander had arranged it all weeks ago. Candlelight flickered against checkered tablecloths, and the place smelled of garlic and red wine. Emily stared at him across the table, stunned. "Why here? Why tonight?" Alexander's hand brushed hers. "Because this is not just about contracts anymore. Because I needed you to know that." Her breath caught, fear and longing warring inside her. That night on the quiet streets of Brooklyn, he kissed her, not for appearances, but with raw hunger, his arms wrapping around her as if letting go was impossible. Emily clung to him with equal desperation. Knowing the line they crossed could never be undone. When they returned to the penthouse, he confessed in a voice rough with truth. "I don't want this to end. Not in 6 months. Not ever. I thought I could keep it business, but I cannot." Emily's heart hammered. She had wanted to hear those words for months, yet terror shadowed her joy, because the contract, the lies, the investigation still threatened to rip them apart. The suspense peaked as she lay awake that night staring at the city lights beyond the glass walls. Every choice ahead of them was perilous. If they admitted love, they risked exposing their original deception. If they pretended indifference, they risked losing each other forever. And as the storm clouds gathered over Manhattan again, Emily realized the final reckoning was coming. Not from Carter, not from the officials, but from the truth that could no longer be contained. Love had entered their bargain, and love would demand a price. Neither of them was ready to pay. The day of the second immigration review arrived with a weight heavier than anything Emily had carried before. The officials separated her from Alexander this time, seating her in a sterile room with nothing but a table and a recorder. Questions came fast and sharp. What side of the bed does he prefer? What brand of cologne does he wear? What meal did he cook for you last? Each answer she gave carried the tremor of memory, not rehearsed lines but lived moments. She realized with a jolt that she no longer needed the script. The truth of their shared life had already taken root in her bones. When she was finally released, she stepped into the hallway to find Alexander waiting, his expression unreadable. But when their eyes met, she saw the faintest spark of relief. Hours later, back at the penthouse, silence lingered, both knowing the investigation was far from over. Carter arrived uninvited that evening, his smirk sharp as a blade. He hinted that he had fed information to the authorities, that he held the power to end everything. Emily felt her blood turn cold, but Alexander faced him with a calm she had never seen before. "You may think you hold leverage," he said, "but I no longer live by fear of exposure. If the world must know the truth, they will know it on my terms." Carter left furious, slamming the door behind him. Alexander turned to Emily, his mask of control slipping. "I cannot keep pretending, not with you, not with them. I married you for convenience, but somewhere along the way it became the most real part of my life." He stepped closer, his voice breaking with a vulnerability she had never thought him capable of. "I love you, Emily, not for appearances, not for practicality, but because you've become the air I breathe." Tears blurred her vision as she whispered the words she had kept locked inside. "I love you too. I have for months. Fear kept me silent, but I cannot imagine life without you." The weeks that followed were a storm. The officials dug deeper, but the evidence of their life together was undeniable. Photographs of them at family dinners, testimony from neighbors and staff who had seen affection bloom in stolen glances and quiet gestures. What began as a deception had turned into a truth too strong to be denied. At last, the notice came. Their marriage was deemed valid. The case closed. Emily felt the weight of the contract dissolve like shackles falling from her wrists. But Alexander did not let the moment pass quietly. He arranged a vow renewal at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, roses arching overhead. Her family and friends gathered. This time no contracts, no signatures, no secrets, only love. As Emily walked down the aisle, her father at her side, she saw Alexander waiting, his expression unguarded, filled with a devotion that made her heart ache. When he spoke his vows, his voice trembled. 1 year ago I married you for the wrong reasons. Today I choose you for the only reason that matters. Because I cannot live without you. When it was her turn, Emily promised to love him not for what he had or what he offered, but for the man he had become in her eyes, the man who had taught her that strength was not in walls, but in trust. Their kiss sealed not a bargain, but a future. Cheers rose around them, but Emily heard only the steady beat of his heart against hers. Later, under the stars, Alexander pulled her close and whispered the words that had once been a business mantra, but now carried an entirely different meaning. Forever. She smiled through tears and answered always. What began as a cold transaction for $7 million had become a love story no amount of money could ever buy, a union born of necessity but kept alive by choice. Emily knew then that the most powerful decision she had ever made was not signing a contract, but opening her heart to the man she could never leave.